Hidden beneath a sky swollen with the heaviness of an autumn storm, the forest lay silent in a way that felt deliberate, as if the trees themselves were holding back a secret that had been waiting 8 decades to breathe again. The discovery had come from a pair of surveyors mapping new hiking trails along the outskirts of the Bohemian woods, a region where the shadows seemed to gather more quickly than the light, curling around every moss-slick trunk like something alive. Their drone had risen above the treetops, its propellers whining against the wind, and when its camera tilted down, the feed revealed what no one expected to see, suspended in the dense canopy of pines. A shape, too straight to be natural, too metallic to belong to the forest. A wing, a fuselage, a ghost of riveted steel that had no right to still exist there. A bomber that had vanished in 1944. Its surface was mottled with green where moss had claimed it, streaked with pale lichen-like veins across decayed skin. Yet the frame was surprisingly intact, untouched by the violence expected from a crash. No crater, no splintered trees, no path of destruction in the undergrowth below. Instead, the plane rested in the branches as if placed there gently by some patient, unseen hand. The discovery sent a quiet tremor through the local authorities, who in turn alerted a historical research group specializing in wartime disappearances. Among them was Dr. Eleanor Huxley, a historian whose fascination with vanished aircraft bordered on obsession, a trait she rarely tried to hide. She arrived in the forest within hours, stepping between the roots with a reverence usually reserved for the halls of cathedrals. To her, this was a sanctuary of forgotten truths. As she lifted her eyes, she saw the bomber suspended above her like a carcass, hung for inspection, the fading insignia of the Luftwaffe ghosting across the metal. Model designation suggested a Junkers Ju-88, a versatile bomber used extensively in the early years of the war. But this one appeared different, almost too pristine in its decay. She felt an involuntary shiver, not from the chill in the air, but from the oppressive stillness that cloaked the clearing. Even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the scene. She took slow breaths as she circled the area, the soft crunch of damp needles under her boots sounding too loud. Something about the sight was wrong, unsettling in a way that had nothing to do with wartime wreckage. At first glance, the branches supporting the aircraft looked impossibly intact for the weight they bore. Thick limbs cradled the metal, but there was no sign of breakage, no splintered wood, no scars on the bark, as if the trees had grown around the bomber instead of being struck by it. Dr. Huxley narrowed her eyes. Growth rings enveloping fragments of the undercarriage suggested decades of slow, patient expansion. It was as though the forest had chosen to keep the aircraft elevated, hiding it just beyond human reach and memory. She wondered what else the trees had hidden over the years, and whether this whole region was a burial ground for forgotten machines and their lost crews. That thought alone seemed to thicken the air around her, making each breath feel heavier. She was not alone in her unease. The surveyors stood several meters away, whispering in subdued voices, as if afraid to stir something ancient. One of them kept glancing upward, his hand flexing nervously at his side. The other wiped rainwater from his brow, though the sky had yet to break. When Dr. Huxley approached, they straightened, eager to pass the responsibility of the discovery onto someone more suited to its weight. She questioned them carefully. They had noticed nothing unusual before launching the drone, no signs that the forest had concealed something so large, no reports of crashes in the area, no local legends that might explain such an anomaly. Their confusion only sharpened her own curiosity. When she asked them what they thought had happened to the crew, both men exchanged a glance that betrayed a discomfort deeper than simple uncertainty. They had not seen bodies, they explained. No remains, no uniforms, no scattered bones among the underbrush. It was as if the plane had been placed here empty, abandoned before reaching its final stage of decay. And yet somehow the cockpit canopy was still sealed. Dr. Huxley felt a cold pulse ripple through her stomach. The image of an untouched cockpit implied that whatever had happened to the crew had occurred before impact, if impact was even the right word for such a bizarre resting place. She forced herself to look upward again, studying the glass that reflected the muted sky. The canopy's surface was clouded by time, but she could still make out a distortion within, a shape or shadow she could not quite define from the ground. As she continued her examination, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She knew that each lost aircraft carried with it an unwritten chapter of the war, stories between the lines of official records, stories of vanished men whose fates had been left to speculation. She felt an almost gravitational pull toward the bomber, an urge to uncover the truth despite the dread uncoiling slowly in her ribs. The forest felt expectant, like something watching from the dark spaces between the trunks, something old and patient. And here, in the midst of this thickening tension and the strange quiet of a forest that had guarded its secret for so long, she thought of you on the other side of the screen, following this mystery through her eyes. It felt strangely grounding to remember the world beyond this oppressive place. Perhaps you have seen something unusual in the woods before, or stumbled upon a remnant of history long forgotten. Tell me, where are you watching this from? The question slipped into her thoughts, naturally, a faint echo against the heavy silence surrounding the discovery. But the forest offered no answers, only the rhythmic tapping of a lone pine cone falling through layers of branches until it struck the ground with a muted thud. The sound made the surveyors flinch. Dr. Huxley steadied herself, forcing her heartbeat to slow. She needed to find a way up to the wreckage. The canopy was too high for ladders, and the tree trunks were slick from days of mist. They would need equipment. She radioed her team, requesting climbing gear, floodlights, and a small crane to elevate a platform. As she waited, she walked the perimeter again, each step a reminder of how strange this scene was. There should have been debris scattered around, remnants of an explosion or impact, yet the forest floor was undisturbed, blanketed only in generations of fallen needles and decayed leaves. Hours later, as dusk began to swallow the last traces of sunlight, her team arrived. They moved with quiet efficiency, setting up ropes and securing harnesses. Floodlights pierced the gloom, illuminating the suspended bomber in harsh beams that made the metal gleam like the shell of some enormous insect trapped in a web of branches. The sight only deepened the sense of wrongness. The light seemed unable to fully reach the cockpit, as if the glass absorbed it. Dr. Huxley felt her pulse quicken again. She thought she saw movement inside, just a flicker, but when she blinked, the interior remained still. With measured steps, she began her ascent. Each movement up the rope felt like a confrontation, her body rising toward a truth the forest had been reluctant to release. As she neared the fuselage, she could hear the faint echo of the wind vibrating through hollow metal. Her gloves brushed the hull, and it was colder than she expected, colder than the air around it, as if it held the last breath of the winter it vanished into in 1944. That cold traveled through her bones, settling like frost beneath her skin. She traced her hand along the surface, feeling dents and scratches that told stories of turbulence, of stress and strain. But none of the marks suggested violent impact. It was as if the aircraft had simply stopped, frozen mid-flight, and descended into the arms of the forest without force. The impossibility of it made her throat tighten. When she reached the cockpit, she steadied herself on a branch thick enough to support her weight. The canopy was fogged over, but at this distance she could see outlines behind the glass, shapes that suggested seats, controls, and something else, something unnervingly still. Her breath shortened. She leaned closer, pressing her gloved hand to the glass, trying to see past the murky film. As she wiped a small circle with her thumb, the interior revealed itself in fragments. The pilot's seat was occupied. The figure sitting there was rigid, draped in the tattered remnants of a uniform that had faded into indistinguishable shades of gray. Skin stretched over bone like parchment, eye sockets hollow, a face frozen not in terror, but in something she couldn't quite name. Not peace, not fear, something between, something worse. Her stomach lurched as she realized the hands of the pilot were still gripping the controls, fingers curled with unnatural tension, as though he had been holding his position for the full span of the 80 years he had remained hidden. She recoiled slightly, then forced herself closer. She needed to see more. She needed to understand. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned in, but before she could wipe another patch clean, she noticed something else. The co-pilot's seat was empty. The emptiness of that second seat carried more weight than the corpse in the first. The bomber flew with a minimum crew of 4, sometimes 5, yet only the pilot remained. No remains in the back. No sign of struggle. No sign of escape. Just the pilot alone, gripping controls that no longer mattered. She pulled back, mind racing through possibilities. Did the crew bail out before reaching this forest? Were they lost somewhere else, buried by time? Or had something happened inside the aircraft that drove them to abandon their posts? She felt the forest watching again, the branches creaking softly as if reacting to her discovery. By the time she descended to the ground, her legs trembled. The air felt heavier now, thicker with knowledge that should have remained buried. The team gathered around her, their faces tense with unasked questions. She told them only what she could confirm: one body, intact, still strapped to the pilot's seat. No immediate signs explaining the strange perch of the bomber. No answers yet, only more layers of confusion. She kept the deeper unease to herself, the sense that this aircraft had not merely fallen here, but had been kept, preserved by the forest's embrace. As they packed up equipment for the night, she felt compelled to whisper into the shadowed clearing, a quiet plea for the forest to relinquish the rest of its secrets. Something inside her insisted that the discovery of the pilot was only the beginning, and that the forest had not yet revealed the darker truth intertwined with this plane's long disappearance. A truth that felt close, almost breathing against her ear as the last floodlight clicked off, and the night swallowed everything again. If you're still with me, drawn deeper into this strange and unsettling discovery, don't forget to stay close as the mystery unfolds. Let the shadows hold you just a little longer. And if this story has already taken root in your thoughts, consider subscribing so you don't lose your way as we continue tracing the final path of a bomber that should never have ended here. The next morning, mist had swallowed the forest whole. It hung low between the trees, coiling through the underbrush and clinging to the trunks like slow-moving smoke. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine resin, heavy enough to taste. Dr. Huxley stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath rising in pale ribbons as she stared up at the silhouette of the bomber still suspended in the canopy above. In the pale dawn it looked even more ghostly, the dull gray of its fuselage blending into the fog, almost dissolving into it. Overnight, something in her mind had shifted. What had begun as a historical anomaly now felt like a haunting. She had spent the few hours before sunrise staring at the photographs taken from the previous evening, enlarging, enhancing, searching for details that might make sense of what she had seen. But the more she examined them, the less the image looked like wreckage, and more like a relic caught between worlds, between life and death, history and myth. The research team had returned with new equipment, cranes, stabilization harnesses, and sealed specimen containers. They were no longer treating the site like an ordinary recovery. It had become an archaeological dig through time itself. Huxley briefed them in hushed tones, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind, as though she feared waking something that had slept for decades. She divided them into units, one to document, one to recover the remains, one to analyze the surrounding vegetation. The forest floor had to be understood as much as the wreck itself. Every inch might hold a clue to how the bomber had survived suspended for so long. When she looked around, the trees seemed to lean inward, as if eavesdropping on their plans. It wasn't superstition, it was instinct. The forest didn't feel passive, it felt aware. She couldn't explain it in academic terms, but something in her gut told her the place had memory. An intelligence woven through its roots and branches that had accepted this machine into its ecosystem, like a parasite it had chosen not to reject. The idea disturbed her, but it also fascinated her in the same way a wound draws both fear and curiosity. As the crane lifted the platform upward again, she followed, her boots clinking softly on the metal as it rose toward the bomber. The drone of machinery mixed with the murmur of the forest, until both became one continuous hum. When she reached the level of the cockpit, the early light filtered through the mist, painting the glass in ghostly shades of silver. She could see the pilot more clearly now, the dried folds of his uniform clinging to bone. She found herself wondering who he had been. Not as a soldier, but as a man. Was his name lost to records? Had his family waited for news that never came? Assuming he had burned somewhere over Eastern Europe, never knowing he had been hanging above this forest all along? She raised her camera, capturing detailed images of the insignia on the fuselage. The fading serial numbers were just legible enough to trace later. But something strange caught her eye near the nose section. A series of symbols etched faintly into the metal, too small to be part of the factory markings. At first, she assumed they were corrosion marks, random scratches from decades of exposure, but the more she looked, the clearer the shapes became. They weren't random at all. They formed patterns, deliberate and unnatural, not letters, not numbers, but symbols, circular and angular, intersecting like fragments of some archaic alphabet. She ran her gloved fingers over them, feeling the faint ridges of engraving beneath the thin film of moss. The cold of the metal seemed sharper here, biting into her skin through the gloves. She called one of the technicians over, asking for a closer inspection. When he leaned in with a handheld light, the carvings stood out starkly against the steel. These weren't done at the factory, he murmured, his voice wavering. Looks like someone etched them afterward. Huxley nodded, her thoughts racing. Inside the war effort, the Luftwaffe sometimes carried out experimental missions, psychological warfare, encrypted routes, occult experiments linked to the Ahnenerbe division. Could this be part of that? She was half speaking to herself, But the technician swallowed hard, unwilling to respond. The historian in her wanted to rationalize it. Perhaps the symbols were coordinates or technical notations, but the deeper part of her, the one that felt the pulse of the forest and the unnatural stillness around them, sensed something older in those markings. They didn't belong to any modern system. They looked ritualistic, closer to sigils than to script. She took several photos, making mental notes to cross-reference them later. Then with care, she pried open the cockpit canopy. The seal broke with a sound like the exhale of a corpse, a soft hiss that made the hairs on her arms rise. The stench of age rolled out. Not rot exactly, but something stale, metallic, and mineral, like air trapped inside a tomb. She reached inside slowly, touching the pilot's sleeve. The fabric disintegrated at her fingertips, turning to gray dust that spiraled into the air before vanishing into the mist. Beneath the uniform, she could see a thin chain still draped around the skeletal neck. A small medallion hung from it. Not military issue, not part of the standard Luftwaffe gear. It was circular, engraved with the same strange markings that adorned the fuselage. Huxley froze. Her breath caught in her throat. For a long moment she could only stare. The medallion glinted faintly, the light from the forest canopy flickering across its surface like a pulse. She felt dizzy, a ringing sound filling her ears that wasn't the hum of the machinery below. It felt almost like a vibration, subtle but steady, resonating through the air around the medallion. She blinked, but it didn't stop. It was as though the object itself was humming softly, at a frequency too low for hearing, but too real to ignore. When she finally managed to remove it, the vibration ceased. Silence dropped around her like a curtain. The forest seemed to inhale again, the branches shifting overhead in slow, synchronized movement. A flock of crows startled from somewhere deep in the woods, their cries harsh and chaotic as they vanished into the mist. Huxley pocketed the medallion without thinking. A part of her brain screamed that she shouldn't have touched it, but curiosity drowned the warning. She climbed back down, her mind pulsing with unanswered questions. On the ground, she handed the medallion to one of the analysts. "Document this. Handle it with gloves only," she instructed. Her voice was steadier than she felt. The analyst nodded and carried it carefully to the equipment table, where he began photographing it under controlled light. But as the images appeared on the monitor, something strange occurred. The first photo was clear, the second less so. By the third, the image distorted entirely, lines warping, colors bleeding into one another like liquid shadow. The analyst frowned, adjusting the focus. "The lens is malfunctioning," he muttered. But when he looked through it again, the medallion appeared normal. Only the digital image showed corruption. It wasn't the equipment, it was the object. Huxley felt a chill crawl up her spine. She stepped closer, watching as each new image failed in a slightly different way. Sometimes the distortion resembled static. Other times, shapes seemed to emerge. Faces, eyes, outlines of human forms that vanished as quickly as they appeared. She told the analyst to stop. The rest of the team exchanged uneasy glances. A few whispered theories, some scientific, others superstitious, but none dared say what they truly felt. That this relic didn't belong in their world, that it might have carried something with it from the night it vanished in 1944. They continued their work in silence. As soil samples were taken from beneath the plane, the geologist on site noticed something equally strange. No disturbance layers, no evidence that the bomber had ever crashed or even pressed into the ground. The strata of soil beneath it were perfectly undisturbed, as if the plane had simply materialized above the forest decades after the war. When she reported this to Huxley, the historian could find no explanation that fit the boundaries of logic. The bomber had disappeared in 1944, yet there was no sign of it in any satellite imagery until now, and no record of local witnesses through the years. It was as though time itself had folded around the machine, preserving it in a pocket of unreality. That night, Huxley stayed behind after the team retired to the temporary camp by the forest's edge. She sat beneath the bomber with her flashlight off, the faint glow of the medallion's metal resting in her palm. She told herself she was studying it, but really she couldn't stop staring. The faint vibration had returned, subtle, rhythmic, almost like breathing. She tried to tell herself it was the tremor of her pulse reverberating through her fingers, but the longer she held it, the less sure she became. She thought of the pilot again. Had he known what he was carrying? Was this the reason his crew had vanished, leaving him alone in a cockpit frozen in time? The more she thought about it, the more the story began to take shape in her mind. A mission that was never reported, a secret cargo transported under orders too classified to appear in any archive, and a crew that paid the price for carrying it. But what kind of mission would demand the use of symbols and talismans like this one? The fog thickened, muffling the forest around her. Every so often she heard faint sounds, the snap of a twig, the whisper of something brushing through the leaves. She lifted her head, heart pounding. The light from her lamp caught the lower trunks, but beyond them was only shifting gray. The sound came again, closer this time. She stood, clutching the medallion. "Who's there?" she called softly. No answer. Only the creak of branches and the faint groan of metal from above, as the bomber swayed slightly, like something stirring in its sleep. The unease grew until she could no longer stand still. She walked back toward camp, her footsteps quick, eyes darting between the trees. When she finally reached the tents, she exhaled in relief. But the feeling didn't leave her. The medallion still felt warm in her pocket, pulsing faintly against her leg. That night, she dreamed of the forest folding in on itself, the trees bending like soldiers under command, their branches entwining around the bomber and pulling it deeper into the canopy. The pilot's hollow eyes watched her from the cockpit, lips moving silently, mouthing words she couldn't hear. When she woke before dawn, the sound of distant humming lingered in the air, faint but persistent, as though the forest itself was singing the same low note that lived inside the medallion. The investigation had only just begun, but already the line between history and nightmare had started to blur. And as the sun rose again over the skeletal trees, its weak light cutting through the mist, Dr. Huxley knew that something was awakening with it. Something that had been waiting 80 years to be found. If this mystery already has your thoughts tangled in its branches, stay close to the story. There are still darker truths waiting in the shadows of the next chapter, and you won't want to face them alone. Subscribe before we descend any further into the forest's secrets. By the third day, the forest had become a labyrinth of metal, ropes, and uneasy breath. The air buzzed with tension and the constant murmur of voices speaking just above a whisper, as if too loud a sound might disturb the delicate balance keeping the bomber aloft. The mist had thinned, but a pale, diffused light still clung to the ground, refusing to let the place feel entirely alive. Dr. Eleanor Huxley walked among the tangle of equipment, her boots sinking into the damp soil that smelled of rust and rain. She had barely slept, Her dreams had turned to static. Flashes of symbols, of the pilot's desiccated face, of the medallion's dull shimmer, pulsing like a heartbeat behind her eyes. She knew something had shifted since the medallion's removal. The air felt heavier now, the forest quieter. Birds no longer perched on the branches above the clearing. Even the insects had withdrawn, leaving an absence so total it felt manufactured. The trees no longer swayed naturally. They seemed to hold their breath, trunks rigid, limbs still. The forest was waiting. For what, she didn't know. But she could feel it pressing against her skin, an unseen pressure that seemed to intensify the longer she stood beneath that suspended machine. The analysts had been unable to photograph the medallion further. Every digital image degraded within seconds, data corrupting beyond retrieval. They'd resorted to sketching it by hand. Yet even the drawings seemed to change subtly when left unattended. Lines bending, shapes shifting as though the memory of the object refused to stay still. Huxley had ordered the medallion sealed inside a containment box, yet she could swear she still felt it, humming somewhere near her desk. She caught herself checking her pockets repeatedly, half expecting to find it there again. At noon, a second recovery team arrived from Prague. Engineers, historians, and one forensic pathologist named Dr. Lucas Rayner. He was older, gray-haired, with sharp eyes and the air of someone who had seen too much death to be easily unsettled. Yet even he hesitated when he first looked up at the bomber hanging in its unnatural cradle of branches. "It looks preserved," he murmured, almost as if time decided to forget it. Huxley nodded. "That's exactly what it feels like." Rayner's attention drifted to the canopy above, to the pale curve of the cockpit, where the pilot still sat frozen in his seat. "I've examined hundreds of wartime remains," he said softly, "but this doesn't look like 80 years of decay. It looks like suspended decomposition, like something stopped it." His words struck a chord she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. That afternoon, they began the delicate process of extracting the pilot's remains. It took hours. The crane groaned under the bomber's weight as the team secured the harnesses and gently lifted the cockpit section free from the surrounding branches. When the segment finally touched the forest floor, a deep vibration ran through the ground, faint but undeniable, like a heartbeat echoing from beneath the roots. Several of the crew stepped back instinctively. Huxley felt it in her bones. A rhythmic pulse, slow and steady, impossible to explain. For a moment, it felt as though the forest itself had reacted to the dismemberment of the aircraft, as though it mourned or protested the intrusion. Then the feeling subsided, leaving only silence. Rayner moved in with quiet efficiency, directing his assistants to stabilize the remains. When the canopy was removed, the pilot's head tilted slightly to the side, bones creaking faintly as if resisting movement. Dust lifted from the uniform in thin spirals. Huxley watched from a distance, arms crossed tightly. Even from where she stood, she could see that the remains were different, almost mummified, not decomposed. The skin clung to bone like aged parchment. But the eyes, they were not fully gone. Desiccated, yes, but still retaining some semblance of form, as though preserved by conditions that made no scientific sense. Rayner examined the hands next. The fingers were still locked around the controls, but not from rigor mortis. The ligaments had hardened unnaturally, fibers intact, far beyond expected preservation. "It's as if he's been drained," Rayner murmured, almost reverently. "Not mummified, emptied." Huxley approached cautiously. "Emptied of what?" Reiner hesitated before answering. Vitality, moisture, something I can't define. As he worked, Huxley's gaze fell again on the side of the cockpit. More of the same strange symbols carved faintly into the metal lining beneath the paint. They were everywhere once she began looking closely. Scratched into the pedals, etched into the handles, even scrawled faintly on the oxygen gauges. Some were drawn hastily, others with precision, but all radiated a feeling of intent. They weren't markings of fear. They were inscriptions of invocation, like prayers or commands. When she leaned closer to examine one near the pilot's seat, a faint impression appeared beside it. A handprint, small, ghostly, left behind by something not made of flesh. She blinked, and it vanished. Her pulse quickened. She stepped back, trying to rationalize the vision, but deep down, she knew what she'd seen. The realization filled her with an irrational dread. These symbols hadn't been placed by accident. They were part of whatever had happened on this plane before it vanished, and somehow the forest had been complicit in its silence ever since. By evening, the remains had been carefully removed and sealed within a temperature-controlled container for transport. But as the crew began packing up, one of the technicians, a young man named Pavel, called out sharply, "Dr. Huxley, come look at this." She hurried over. He was kneeling near the base of one of the largest trees, flashlight trembling in his hand. The roots had begun to shift, or rather something beneath them had. As the light moved across the soil, it revealed fragments of metal buried shallowly beneath the surface. Not wreckage from the bomber. The composition was different, sleeker, smoother, almost polished. Pavel brushed more soil away until a pattern emerged. Another symbol, identical to those on the fuselage. It was burned into the metal, edges glowing faintly, as though still smoldering for decades underground. They recoiled. Huxley crouched, staring in disbelief. The symbol wasn't merely carved. It was alive with faint light, a pulsing red that faded and brightened in rhythm with that same heartbeat she had felt earlier. She turned to Raynor. What could cause that? He shook his head. Nothing I know of, nothing natural. The air grew colder. A sound rippled through the forest, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The trees vibrated slightly, their branches trembling though no wind moved among them. The hum deepened, and Huxley felt it inside her chest, a vibration that wasn't heard but felt. It grew stronger until the light beneath the roots flared once, blindingly bright, and then extinguished completely. Silence. The light from their flashlights flickered erratically before stabilizing again. When Huxley looked back at the ground, the symbol was gone, the soil smooth and undisturbed, as though it had never been there. No one spoke for several minutes. Eventually she said quietly, "Document everything, even if there's nothing to see now." The crew obeyed, but their hands trembled. Something unseen had shifted in the forest that night. Later, back at the camp, Raynor joined Huxley by the fire, his face pale. "You know," he said quietly, "I've heard of units like this one before, aircraft that vanished without trace during missions near the Eastern Front. Some say they were testing devices meant to distort radar signals, experimental magnetic fields." He hesitated. Others said it was more than that some groups under the SS were attempting to manipulate dimensions of time itself. Not machines, but rituals, hybrid sciences. They called it Die Schwelle, the threshold. Huxley's blood ran cold. She had read fragments about such operations in restricted archives. the blend of pseudoscience and occultism that had taken root in certain factions of the Reich's research divisions. But they were always treated as myth, exaggerations born of post-war fear. What if this was one of them? Rayner continued, a test flight carrying something it shouldn't have, something they couldn't control. She thought of the medallion, the symbols, the unnatural preservation, the forest that seemed to breathe. The pieces began to align in ways she didn't want to accept. That night, the team stayed awake in shifts. The forest never slept. Faint sounds drifted through the trees. Whispers like air drawn through hollow reeds, distant clicks and murmurs that seemed almost linguistic. Huxley sat in her tent, the medallion's containment box on the table beside her. It vibrated faintly, its metal surface warm despite the chill outside. She stared at it for hours, unable to look away. At one point, she thought she saw condensation forming on the inside of the box. Not moisture, but something like breath. She reached for the lid, then froze. From somewhere outside, a scream tore through the night. Short, sharp, human. The camp erupted in confusion, flashlights flaring, boots pounding against soil. Huxley and Rayner ran toward the sound. They found Pavel kneeling near the tree line, eyes wide, skin pale as bone. He pointed toward the darkness beyond the lights. It was him, he stammered. The pilot. I saw him standing there. Rayner grabbed his shoulders. That's impossible. The remains are secured. Pavel shook violently. No, not the body. Him, whole, standing there, watching. The forest swallowed the silence that followed. They searched for hours but found nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the same oppressive stillness pressing against their eardrums. When dawn came, the crew was hollow-eyed and shaken. Pavel refused to speak again, staring only at the trees, whispering something over and over under his breath. Steht noch dort. He still stands there. Huxley documented everything, but her rational mind was crumbling under the weight of the inexplicable. What if the forest wasn't just guarding the wreck? What if it was part of it, an extension of whatever energy had anchored the plane here for 8 decades? The bomber, the medallion, the hum beneath the roots. All of it was connected by a thread that ran deeper than history, deeper than science. Something had crossed the threshold in 1944, and now that it had been disturbed, the forest could no longer contain it. And for the first time, Doctor, Huxley realized that the plane hadn't been found by accident. It had been waiting. If you've been drawn this far into the silence of this haunted forest, let your curiosity sink deeper, but hold tight. The next descent will take us past the line where reason ends. Subscribe, so you don't lose the path when the shadows close in. By the 4th day, the forest had become more than a site of investigation. It had transformed into a threshold between what could be studied and what could only be felt. The line between science and superstition blurred with every breath, every vibration that hummed beneath the soil. Dr. Eleanor Huxley stood before the suspended remains of the Junkers Ju-88, her mind fractured between 2 worlds. The methodical clarity of the historian and the dark, unexplainable rhythm of something ancient pulsing beneath her reason. The morning light was pale, washed through layers of fog that never seemed to lift. The forest canopy loomed overhead like the ribs of a sleeping creature, and the silence between the trees had deepened into something close to reverence. No birds had returned. The soil, usually soft and rich with decay, had hardened overnight, as though the earth itself was bracing against intrusion. Huxley could feel it through the soles of her boots. The faint, irregular throb that beat in slow, uneven intervals. Her equipment buzzed with interference. The radio emitted bursts of static that rose and fell like whispers in an unknown tongue. Even the digital recorders, shielded and grounded, picked up faint sounds that didn't belong to any environmental frequency. Raynor had reviewed them in private, and though he had tried to dismiss them as interference, his trembling hands had betrayed him. He had heard it, too. Voices in the static, speaking in fragments of German, distorted and half-swallowed by distortion. Huxley replayed one of the recordings that morning as she prepared her notes. Through the hiss and hum, she could make out a single phrase repeated twice, both times accompanied by a faint mechanical whine. Zurück zur Schwelle. Return to the threshold. She didn't tell the others. Not yet. The medallion remained locked within its containment box, sealed with reinforced steel and wrapped in insulating material. Yet the humming persisted, sometimes so faint it could be mistaken for imagination, other times so strong that cups rattled on the nearby tables. The vibrations seemed to affect certain frequencies of sound, making voices echo strangely and altering the pitch of machinery. The engineers blamed magnetic interference, but none could explain why compasses spun uncontrollably or why batteries drained faster the closer they were placed to the box. That afternoon, the team received word that the serial number on the aircraft had finally been traced through incomplete Luftwaffe archives. The results were startling. The bomber, designation Ju 4, had been registered to the 7th Experimental Air Wing, a division rumored to have operated under the supervision of the SS's Ahnenerbe unit, a faction obsessed with occult science. The official report listed it as missing in action during a classified operation codenamed Project Nachtsprung. Night Leap, conducted in February 1944, somewhere near the border of Poland and Czechoslovakia. No details existed on the mission's purpose, but the flight log indicated that the crew had been ordered to transport Object 77L to an undisclosed facility in Bavaria. The cargo's description was redacted, replaced only with a cryptic note, "Do not open before arrival. Under no circumstances initiate sequence without command authorization." Huxley read the report twice, her pulse quickening with each line. Object 77L. The medallion, the connection, was undeniable. Whatever the crew had been transporting, it had not been a weapon of war in the conventional sense. It had been something older, something designed to reach beyond the boundaries of human control. As evening fell, the forest grew darker than it should have. The light seemed to collapse into itself, leaving the air heavy and metallic. The scent of ozone prickled the senses. Huxley and Raynor stood beneath the plane's undercarriage, examining newly exposed portions of the fuselage. They found more of the strange etchings, but these were different. Deeper, carved from inside the metal as though burned outward by heat or force. "What if this isn't writing?" Raynor said quietly. "What if it's residue? The mark left by whatever Object 77L did before the crash." Huxley looked at him. "You think the object activated?" He hesitated. If it did, it may have torn a hole through something. The word something lingered between them like smoke. Then a sound rose from deep within the forest. Low at first, like the drone of wind through hollow wood, then building into a vibration that made the air itself quiver. The trees swayed without breeze. The floodlights flickered. Huxley felt her stomach tighten. The sound grew louder until it seemed to come from beneath their feet. The ground pulsed once, a single, resonant thud that made every piece of metal tremble. And then silence. Moments later, a shout came from the perimeter. Two guards, had been patrolling the north line when one of them vanished mid-call. The other returned white-faced, his weapon clutched tightly to his chest. "He was right behind me," he stammered. "We were walking the ridge. Then I turned and he was gone. No sound, no light, nothing." Searchlights combed the area for hours. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of struggle. Only the same cold mist creeping through the undergrowth, swallowing the beam of every light. At 3 a.m., the Lost Guard's radio came to life. Static at first, then faint breathing, and beneath it, a whispering voice. German again, but older, slower. "Nicht zurücksehen, don't look back." They found the radio near the base of one of the trees where the strange symbols had first been discovered, its casing slick with condensation. The missing guard's fingerprints were still fresh on the dial. Rayner refused to sleep after that. He and Huxley remained awake by the central tent, watching the bomber loom above them, its silhouette barely visible through the fog. Every few minutes they could swear the plane shifted slightly, its frame groaning as if adjusting its position among the branches. Once, the canopy caught the faint reflection of their lights, and for a heartbeat, Huxley thought she saw the pilot again. Upright, intact, eyes open. But when she blinked, the figure dissolved into shadow. Her mind was unraveling under the strain of trying to understand what was happening. Science demanded logic, but the forest seemed to operate under an entirely different set of rules. One older than reason, older than language. She thought again of the Ahnenerbe, of their fascination with ancient rites and dimensional gateways. Perhaps the plane hadn't crashed at all. Perhaps it had been pulled or drawn into this place as a result of what they were trying to awaken. At dawn, she made the decision to unseal the medallion. Rayner argued against it, but she was resolute. "We can't study it properly locked away," she said. "If we're going to understand what this thing is, we need to confront it directly." They opened the containment box in the center of the clearing. The medallion lay still for several seconds, its dull metal surface catching the weak light. Then the vibration began again, faint at first, then stronger, until the air around it shimmered. Instruments nearby went haywire. Digital clocks froze at 47 and refused to move. The medallion lifted, slowly, silently, hovering an inch above the box. Every person in the clearing froze. Cameras captured nothing but static. Sensors failed instantly. The medallion spun, faster and faster, a blur of motion emitting a low, resonant hum that grew deeper by the second. Huxley took a step back, eyes wide. "It's responding," she whispered. "To what?" Rayner asked. Before she could answer, the bomber above them groaned violently. The sound of metal bending echoed through the forest, branches snapping as the aircraft shifted. The floodlights flared, washing the canopy in harsh white. The medallion's spin abruptly stopped, hanging perfectly still in midair. And the hum ceased. Then came the whisper. It emanated from everywhere at once, soft and overlapping, countless voices murmuring in German, English, languages long dead. The words were indecipherable, but their cadence was unmistakable. Invocation, a summoning. The medallion dropped. The ground shuddered, and from the depths of the forest, a light began to glow, faint and white, pulsing through the fog like distant lightning. It expanded slowly, illuminating the trunks from below as if something enormous were rising beneath the roots. The vibration returned, this time so strong it made teeth ache. The branches above swayed as though reacting to some unseen force, and the bomber shifted again, lowering slightly, the canopy tilting toward the source of the light. Rayner shouted for the crew to fall back, but the air had thickened, heavy as water. Moving felt impossible. Huxley could only watch as the ground beneath the light began to crack, soil splitting like fractured glass. The sound that followed was unlike anything human. Deep, resonant, layered with the faint echo of engines and screams. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light vanished. The forest fell silent. When Huxley regained her breath, she realized the medallion was gone. The containment box lay open, empty. In its place, a faint circle of scorched earth marked the ground. The bomber above had fallen perfectly still again, its fuselage dark and lifeless. They searched for hours, but the medallion had vanished completely. By sunrise, several of the crew refused to stay. Two left without permission, driving through the forest road before dawn. Huxley didn't stop them. Part of her wanted to leave as well, but something in her refused to turn away. The same force that had drawn her here in the first place. The forest felt incomplete now, as though whatever had been sleeping beneath it was no longer contained. That morning, when the mist began to lift, Rayner approached her with a grim expression. "You should see this," he said. He led her to the edge of the clearing. In the soft earth beneath a fallen branch, something had appeared overnight. A perfect impression of the medallion, burned into the soil. But this time, it was joined by a second shape, a human footprint beside it, half buried, pointing toward the forest interior. Huxley felt her breath catch. The print was too clean, too fresh. Someone, or something, had taken the medallion, and it was walking deeper into the woods. She looked toward the trees, where the mist thickened again into a gray veil, and for a moment she thought she saw a silhouette. Tall, motionless, watching. Then it vanished, leaving only the endless whisper of the forest. And somewhere far above, the hollow bomber groaned softly, as if laughing in its sleep. If you've stayed with this story through every shiver and shadow, don't drift away yet. What comes next will tear through the thin line between what was and what remains. Subscribe. Stay close, before the forest closes behind us forever. The fifth day began with fog thicker than before, not drifting or moving, but clinging, suffocating, like a physical presence that refused to disperse. The trees stood like silhouettes behind a white curtain, their branches lost to the air. It was impossible to tell where the forest ended and the sky began. Dr. Eleanor Huxley had not slept. The night had been filled with faint noises, footsteps crunching in the leaves beyond camp, the distant echo of breathing that didn't belong to anyone she could see. Every time she closed her eyes, the memory of the medallion's hum returned, synchronized perfectly with her heartbeat, until she began to wonder whether it had ever stopped resonating inside her chest. The medallion was gone, but its absence had a shape. The forest had changed since it disappeared. The fog no longer felt like weather. It felt like consequence. When she looked at the bomber suspended above, it seemed lower than before, as if slowly descending, drawn toward the forest floor by something unseen. Its metal surface had darkened overnight, streaked now with thin black lines like veins spreading beneath the paint. The symbols etched into its hull seemed deeper, as though they had burned themselves further into the steel. Rayner noticed it, too. He stood beside her, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. "It's reacting," he murmured. "The plane. It's responding to the loss of the object." Huxley's jaw tightened, or whatever took it. The crew had thinned. Those who remained worked in silence, avoiding the tree line. Every sound was magnified. The rustle of fabric, the crunch of boots, the occasional creak of metal from the suspended wreck. Radios still failed to transmit, compasses spun endlessly, and GPS readings looped in circles, as if the forest itself distorted navigation. By now, most of the team believed they were standing in a place that obeyed no normal geography. The forest did not appear on recent topographic maps, nor on any satellite imagery prior to 2023. It was as though this section of land had materialized only when the bomber revealed itself. Huxley spent the morning analyzing soil samples from the scorch mark left by the medallion. The chemical composition was unlike anything she'd seen. The silicate structure of the earth had fused, transforming into a glassy layer resembling obsidian. The radiation readings spiked briefly, then dropped to zero, as though the phenomenon had reset itself. It was as if the medallion had imprinted its energy into the ground, and then withdrawn it, leaving behind a scar that was neither chemical nor physical, but something in between. When she lifted her eyes from the samples, she saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a flicker of shadow that darted behind a tree. She froze, staring. Nothing, just the heavy, expectant quiet. She told herself it was fatigue, the mind creating patterns in mist. But later, when she reviewed the security footage, the shadow appeared again. A tall, human-like figure, blurry but solid, moving through the fog with deliberate slowness. It passed between two floodlights, paused, and turned its head toward the camera. Only for a second. But that second was enough. The shape of the face matched the skeletal outline of the pilot. Her breath left her body in a shallow gasp. She replayed the footage again and again, each time praying she was mistaken. But there it was. Unmistakable. The pilot, or something wearing his shape, moving freely through the forest, no longer bound to the cockpit where his remains had been found. When she told Rayner, his face drained of color. "We disturbed it," he said flatly. "We broke whatever kept him in that plane." The implications hung heavy between them. That night, they organized a search party of 4, Huxley, Rayner, and 2 remaining crew members. They followed the faint trail of footprints leading away from the clearing, the same ones discovered near the burned impression of the medallion. The path wound deep into the forest, where the mist thickened until visibility dropped to a few meters. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, the temperature falling inexplicably despite no change in weather. Their breaths came out in visible plumes, and frost began to form on the branches, glistening faintly in the beam of their flashlights. After 30 minutes, the trees changed. The trunks grew straighter, denser, and their bark took on an unnatural sheen, like metal beneath organic skin. Huxley reached out to touch one. The surface was smooth, cold, too cold, and her fingertips tingled as though touching static electricity. When she pulled her hand back, a faint pattern glowed where her skin had made contact, the same sigil etched on the bomber. Rayner caught her arm. "Don't touch anything else," he said sharply. "This isn't normal forest growth. It's assimilation." She frowned. "Assimilation?" He nodded grimly. "The roots, the soil, the metal. It's all merging. The forest is absorbing the wreck." They continued forward until they reached a clearing, unlike the one they had left. Here the trees encircled a hollow space, where the fog thinned slightly. In the center, the ground pulsed faintly, light seeping through cracks in the soil like veins beneath translucent skin. The air vibrated with a low hum, so deep it bypassed hearing and traveled straight into bone. It was the same frequency the medallion had emitted. Rayner stepped forward slowly. "It's beneath us," he whispered. "Object 77L, it's still here." Before Huxley could respond, the light intensified. The ground split open with a soft hiss, releasing a rush of air that smelled of metal and decay. From the fissure, something began to rise. Not solid, not vapor, but a distortion, as though the space itself were folding. It shimmered, forming the faint outline of a figure. For an instant it resembled the pilot, but not the corpse she remembered. This one was whole, standing tall, uniform pristine, eyes black and depthless. He lifted his head, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to emerge from the forest itself, layered and metallic. Nicht zurücksehen, don't look back. The floodlights flickered. Huxley staggered, clutching her chest as the hum grew unbearable. Raynor shouted something she couldn't hear. Then the light burst outward, blinding white, washing over them all. When her vision returned, the clearing was empty. The fissure had sealed, the glow gone. Raynor was gone, too. Only two of them remained. Huxley turned in slow horror, calling his name, but the forest offered no echo. The fog shifted again, heavier now, curling low around her legs. From far behind, deep among the trees, came the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. The remaining technician panicked, running back toward camp. Huxley hesitated only a moment before following, the pounding of her boots drowned by the faint rhythmic pulse beneath the ground. The forest seemed alive now, every branch twitching as though breathing. She didn't dare look behind her, remembering the words that had echoed from the pilot's mouth. Don't look back. When she reached camp, everything was wrong. The floodlights were out. The equipment lay scattered, the tents torn open. A low, rhythmic clicking filled the air, echoing like Morse code from nowhere visible. She could see the bomber above, still suspended, but its lights, those faint internal reflections she had thought were tricks of the eye, now glowed red through the cockpit glass. She turned to the technician, but he was gone. One moment he had been behind her, the next, only empty air. She was alone. The clicking grew louder, faster. It became a voice, not quite human, fractured, layered, speaking words she couldn't decipher. Her flashlight dimmed, flickered, then died. The darkness closed around her, thick as water. She could still see the bomber's red glow pulsing above, like a heartbeat in the canopy. Each pulse made the ground vibrate, and then she heard it, the faint hum returning, rising through her feet, through her bones, through her skull. It wasn't coming from the plane anymore. It was coming from below. She stumbled backward, clutching at her ears as the sound built to a low roar. The air itself seemed to fold, the temperature dropping so fast her breath froze midair. And then, silence. She opened her eyes. The forest was empty. Every trace of the camp was gone. No tents, no lights, no equipment. Even the ground where the plane had hung was bare. No wreck, no trees bent by its weight. Only the pale earth, smooth and untouched, as though nothing had ever been there. The bomber had vanished. She stood trembling in the middle of the clearing that no longer existed, her breath shallow. The fog began to thin at last, revealing the first weak rays of dawn filtering through the skeletal branches. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the faint whine of engines, an old sound, mechanical, coming from above. She lifted her head. Through the thinning mist, far beyond the treetops, a shadow moved across the morning sky. The unmistakable outline of a Junkers Ju 88, gliding silently, its engines dark. It passed overhead without a sound, its trajectory steady, unbroken, as if continuing a flight that had never ended. She fell to her knees, tears freezing on her cheeks. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. Yet she knew, deep in her gut, that the plane wasn't flying forward. It was falling upward, retreating into the same void it had emerged from. And for a moment, before it vanished completely, she saw the cockpit, and inside it, two figures, the pilot, and beside him, a second shape, a woman. Her own face stared back through the glass. The plane dissolved into the light. She never screamed. Only the wind answered, carrying with it the faint echo of the same phrase that had haunted her recordings. Zurück zur Schwelle. Return to the threshold. The forest swallowed the sound and returned to silence. If you've made it this far into the darkness, you've crossed the same line Dr. Huxley did. Stay close. There's only one descent left, and it leads into the truth beneath the forest. Like the story, let the shadows know. Like the video, and stay with us as we step through the final threshold. Days later, the world outside the forest still refused to acknowledge what had happened. The official report filed by the regional authorities listed the site as closed due to environmental contamination. No mention of the bomber, no mention of the vanished personnel. The coordinates were locked, sealed under a classification that stretched all the way to military archives. When journalists asked questions, they were told that the operation had been a simple survey error, a drone malfunction, a misread satellite image. The forest did not exist on any official map again. Dr. Eleanor Huxley was the only one who returned. Or rather, something that bore her name did. 3 weeks after the disappearance of the team, a hiker stumbled upon a lone figure wandering near the old road that led toward the Bohemian border. The woman's clothes were torn, her hands covered in fine gray ash. She was silent at first, refusing help, staring past everyone who spoke to her. Only later, when taken to a small hospital in Prague, did she whisper her name. Her voice was hoarse, like someone who had swallowed too much air from the wrong world. "Dr. Huxley," she said, but her eyes, those who saw her swore, were not the same. She had been missing for 12 days. When questioned, she offered fragments of memory. She remembered fog, trees that moved when she wasn't looking, a hum that lived beneath the soil. Beyond that, only flashes. The pilot's face, the medallion's vibration, and the sight of the bomber lifting back into the sky. Every attempt to reconstruct her timeline broke down. Some doctors claimed trauma had fractured her perception. Others whispered quietly that she was not suffering from amnesia at all, but from displacement, that what had come out of the forest wasn't entirely human. The authorities confiscated all remaining footage and equipment, including the damaged recording devices retrieved from the original camp perimeter. Most of them were corrupted, filled with static, noise, and fragments of distorted sound. But a few seconds of audio survived. A faint hum, followed by Huxley's voice saying, "It's beneath us. It's still here." Then a deep mechanical roar and silence. The rest was erased. And yet something lingered. Weeks passed, and in nearby villages, strange phenomena began to spread. Cattle found dead in the fields, their bodies drained of moisture, but without a mark. Electrical failures in the middle of clear weather, compasses spinning wildly within a radius of several kilometers. Locals spoke of lights flickering through the trees at night. Not lanterns, not headlights, but beams of pale, soundless illumination moving low to the ground like searching eyes. The people gave the forest a new name in whispered Czech, Les, který dýchá, the forest that breathes, Researchers from the Institute of Historical Aviation attempted to reopen the investigation, but government restrictions blocked every request. Files relating to Project Nachtsprung disappeared from digital databases overnight. Access credentials were revoked. Dr. Rayner's name, when searched, yielded nothing. No employment records, no publications, no trace that he had ever existed. It was as though he had been erased from history itself. Meanwhile, Dr. Huxley's condition deteriorated. In the hospital, she began to draw, not consciously, but compulsively, covering pages with the same circular symbols that had been etched into the bomber's fuselage. Nurses found her awake at night, humming low tones that vibrated through the walls. When asked what she was doing, she would answer only, listening. On the 13th night, the hospital staff found her room empty. The window was open, though it was 8 stories up. No footprints, no blood, no sign of a fall. Only a faint residue of black ash on the window frame, and the smell of pine. Surveillance footage from the corridor outside her room showed the lights flickering at 2:43 a.m. A shadow passed across the wall, long, angular, mechanical, followed by a low hum, then static. By dawn, the fog had rolled in over Prague. Reports began again within days. A pilot on a civilian route from Munich to Warsaw claimed to have seen an aircraft flying parallel to his altitude. Unmarked, propeller-driven, old. The radar showed nothing, yet the shadow followed his plane for nearly 3 minutes before vanishing into the clouds. He described its shape later to investigators: twin engines, narrow wings, a glass cockpit, a Junkers Ju-88. Others saw it too. Farmers near the German border, a group of hikers in Slovakia. Each described the same silent silhouette gliding through the mist, always just above the tree line, always vanishing before anyone could photograph it. The official response labeled the sightings as mass hysteria. Reflections, tricks of light, old myths reborn through rumor, but one recording surfaced. A wildlife camera placed by an environmental research group captured footage of the forest's edge. The timestamp showed R317, the same frozen time that had appeared on Huxley's malfunctioning instruments. The camera's night vision flared suddenly, and for exactly 6 seconds, the bomber appeared in frame. Not rusted, not decayed, whole. Engines dark, cockpit glowing faintly from within. As the plane drifted upward and out of sight, a human figure stepped into view beneath it. Tall, unmoving, watching. The recording ended with a single word whispered faintly through the static: Zurück, return. Authorities denied the authenticity of the footage, but independent analysts confirmed the metadata. The file had not been tampered with. After that, no one entered the forest again. The road was blocked, the land declared hazardous, but the fog still rolled across the region, thick and heavy, carrying with it the faint, rhythmic sound of distant engines. Those who live near the perimeter claim that sometimes, just before dawn, a humming sound rises from beneath the earth. Low, resonant, almost like a heartbeat. Dogs refuse to enter the woods. Birds circle, but never land. And on certain nights, when the wind shifts from the east, people swear they can hear voices in the static of their radios, layered and distant, repeating the same phrase that haunted the recordings recovered from the site. Zurück zur Schwelle. Return to the threshold. In time, most forgot. The world moved on, as it always does, but rumors persisted online, in obscure forums dedicated to military anomalies and unsolved disappearances, someone calling themselves Chu 77 began posting cryptic messages there, each one accompanied by coordinates that led nowhere. One message, written in perfect German, read, "The threshold was not closed. The flight continues." No one could trace the account. Its IP address changed with every post, appearing from locations across Europe. Vienna, Dresden, Warsaw, even London. Some users claimed it was an ARG, an elaborate fiction. Others believed it was Huxley herself, speaking through whatever connection had been forged the night the medallion vanished. In early 2024, a group of explorers calling themselves Die Rückkehr, the Return, decided to test the legend. They entered the restricted zone with thermal cameras and recording drones. None came back, but one of their drones, recovered by chance months later, contained a fragment of audio. Beneath layers of distortion, a woman's voice could be heard whispering through the static, "If you find this, don't open it. Don't look back." The timestamp of the recording, 17. After that, no more attempts were made. The government fenced off the region entirely, designating it a biological hazard zone. Satellite imagery of the area remains curiously distorted, as if a constant mist hangs directly above the coordinates. And still, every few months, someone somewhere in Central Europe reports the same dream. A forest bathed in fog, a distant hum beneath the earth, and a bomber gliding silently through the sky, always at the same moment, always at 03:17. For some, the dreams end with silence. For others, with a whisper that pulls them awake in the dark, heart pounding, eyes searching the window for the shape they know they'll never find. They say those who hear the hum once never stop hearing it. It follows them into sleep, into static, into the low vibration of engines overhead. And when it grows loud enough, when it aligns perfectly with their heartbeat, they vanish quietly, without sound, as though answering a call that has no origin and no end. And somewhere far above the clouds, a plane continues its impossible flight. Engines dead, lights flickering. Inside, two figures sit in silence, staring through the glass into an endless night. The pilot grips the controls with skeletal hands, eyes locked forward. Beside him, the woman turns her head slowly, as if sensing something beyond the horizon. Her lips part, and though no sound escapes, the movement is clear. A single word, return. And then, as the clouds close over them, the hum fades once more into the endless static of the sky. If the story gripped you until this final breath, if the forest, the fog, and the hum still echo in your thoughts, leave your mark. Like the video so others may find it. Subscribe so you don't lose your way when the next shadow calls. And tell us in the comments, when you look at the sky tonight, will you be sure it's empty?